Well, good evening. Thank you very much, Rabbi Wolkenfeld, for inviting me back. It's always nice to be here. When I was invited to come to Chicago to become the Beit and to become the chief rabbinical judge of the Chicago Rabbinical Council, I was mostly familiar with the side of the work of the Rabbinical Council that related to rabbinical courts, because that's what I did in New York. I was a judge in rabbinical courts. I presided over cases, over arbitrations. I presided over gittin, over Jewish divorces. I presided over Jewish conversions. So I still do a lot of this work here in Chicago, but most people are familiar with the Chicago Rabbinical Council in terms of the other side of its activity, which is in terms of Kashrut supervision, of supervising kosher products, of supervising restaurants. You walk into any major establishment that's kosher in the Chicagoland area, including Romanian, including Miltz, including the Shallots, including Mariano's, many of the places that have kosher sections. So you see that they are usually under the supervision of the Chicago Rabbinical Council. So one area where I had to get up to speed, so to speak, was in terms of the kashrut side of the operations that became part of the overarching role of the Beit of the Chicago Rabbinical Council, to not only handle traditional rabbinical court matters, but also to be in charge of establishing the policies that would be followed in terms of our kosher supervision. So, for example, there was a stand that was set up recently in Wrigley Field with kosher supervision that also went through the Beit Din, the rabbinical court. What are the parameters that need to be observed in terms of having a stand, a concession, where generally speaking there's a requirement that the concession be open 7 days a week, and you're not allowed to have a business open on Shabbos, so we had to arrange for a transfer of the business for Shabbos. So a lot of these questions pass through the examination and the oversight of the rabbinical court. So what I wanted to speak about during our two-part series are some of the kashrut issues in which I have become involved personally, and in which I have come to appreciate some of the contemporary applications of kosher laws that involve our activities at the Chicago Rabbinical Council and affect your average kosher consumer. So just by further way of introduction, when I supervise a conversion, so when it comes to Jewish conversion, we know that a convert is supposed to accept upon themselves the 613 mitzvot of the Torah, all the 613 commandments. So there was a whole discussion among poskim, among the Jewish law authorities going back 100 years ago, 150 years ago, that they had converts where it wasn't clear to the rabbinical courts that they really were accepting upon themselves all of the 613 mitzvos. Sometimes the converts were converting for the sake of marriage, and there was a real question about whether they had the requisite sincerity to really keep all of the mitzvos of the Torah. I think we've gotten pretty good at the Chicago Rabbinical Council. Rabbi Wolkenfeld knows from first-hand experience we're very rigorous. And when our converts accept the 613 mitzvahs, they really mean it. But there was a question that was posed by Rabbi Chaim Moser Grodzinsky, who was the major halakhic authority in Lithuania before World War II, before the Holocaust. And he was asked, what if it turns out that you have a convert who doesn't end up observing all of the commandments? Can you still say that it was a valid conversion as long as they announced and declared before the Beit Din that their intention was to accept upon themselves all of the mitzvot? So Rabbi Chaim Moser said, well, we have a principle in Jewish law that dvarim shebalev einam dvarim, that if a person has a thought process which they keep on the inside, that doesn't necessarily count. A person enters into a transaction and they have in mind that the transaction should not be valid if they plan to sell their house. And they have in mind that this sale should not be valid unless they're able to complete a sale, a purchase of another house in a different country, and then that other purchase falls through. So they want to nullify the sale of the house that they had transferred to somebody else because the purchase of a different house that they had intended to complete fell through. So the halacha is that the fact that they had this condition in their mind, if it wasn't expressly stipulated and that the world didn't know about it, then it doesn't count, and their sale is still considered to be valid. It can't be nullified because of an undeclared condition. That's called dvarim shebalev einam dvarim, that the thought process which is in a person's heart is not considered to be dispositive if it hasn't been expressed. So Chaim also said the same thing is true, that if you have somebody who converts and in their heart they have in mind that they're going to violate all kinds of averos, they're not going to make brachos on foods, they're not going to do everything 100% perfectly, nonetheless, if they had announced to the Bezdin, and the Bezdin thought, or the Bezdin heard their declaration that they're accepting upon themselves all the mitzvahs, so the conversion could still be valid. He wasn't recommending that such a conversion would be ideal or would be preferred, but he was saying that after the fact such a conversion could still be valid. But he said this of course is not the case if it turns out that the convert had no intention whatsoever, and we pretty much know that the convert has no intention whatsoever of keeping Shabbos, because Shabbos is fundamental to the Jewish religion. It doesn't mean anything to convert to Judaism if everyone knows that the person is not going to keep Shabbos. And then he goes on and he says, and of course the same thing is true about kashrus. If the person is not going to keep kosher, what does it mean to be Jewish if you're not going to keep kosher? Then he has a later response in which he says, oh yeah, and this is also true if the person's not planning to keep the laws of family purity. So this became the definition of modern orthodoxy without realizing it. Rav Chaim Ozek Grodzinski was not a modern orthodox rabbi. Without realizing it, he carved out the cornerstones of modern orthodoxy. It's all about keeping Shabbos and Kashrut, and later on, he came on, with him also was later on, it was in a later response to him, and later on family purity too. So you have those three cornerstones, and that is what defines modern orthodoxy, and a person's not so careful about everything else, okay, fine, we can still consider them to be orthodox. So of course, you're supposed to accept upon yourself all 613 mitzvos. However, what was conveyed in this groundbreaking, famous tshuva of Rav Chaim Ozer was that when we are defining even the most basic cornerstones of what it means to be an Orthodox Jew, what it means to live an observant lifestyle, certainly kashrus is part of that. Keeping kosher is a very, very major part of that. So if a person really wanted to master all of the laws of keeping kosher, the reality is that they're very complex. People don't know too much about Judaism, so they figure, okay, I know that the Jews are not allowed to eat pork. But Jews are not allowed to eat pork. They're not allowed to eat pork plus 500 other things, 5,000 other things. The Torah says that there are certain signs that distinguish kosher animals. If an animal doesn't chew its cud and split its hoof, so then it's not kosher. So all kinds of animals that are not kosher. A camel's not kosher. We have donkeys not kosher. We have lots and lots of animals that are not practically every kosher. A horse, a dog, a cat. Practically every single animal. Very, very few animals are kosher. And then the Torah tells us that there are many birds that are not kosher, many species of fowl that are not kosher, and that fish have to have fins and scales in order to be kosher, and that you can't mix meat and milk together. And then there were all kinds of other laws that you're not allowed to eat the fruit of a tree if it's within the first 3 years of a tree's life, and the laws keep on going on. And even if it is a kosher animal, it has to be slaughtered a particular way, it has to be shechted a particular way. We actually supervise a shechita, we supervise kosher slaughter. We have kosher slaughterhouses where our shoftim, where our slaughterers actually carry out the shechita the way that it's supposed to be done. We have 3 different facilities right now. We have one in Denver, and we have one in Mexico, and we have one in Dallas. I think the one in Denver is called Greenie, and the one in Mexico is called Goosey. So we have Goosey Greenie. Okay. Goosey Greenie, and we have Dallas. So we have places where we shecht the sheep and where we shecht cows, and it has to be done in a very careful and a very detailed and a very expert fashion. And even when you shecht an animal, there are parts of the animal that you can't eat. You can't eat the blood of an animal. You can't eat the fat. There are many different fatty parts of an animal. There are two different types of animals. There are behemoths, regular domesticated animals. Then there are chayos, what we call the beasts of the field. If it's a regular behemoth, then you're not allowed to eat. You're not allowed to eat the chaylev. You're not allowed to eat the fatty parts. And you have to figure out with salt how to drain the blood, and you have to figure out afterwards how to clean out all the fatty parts. You can't eat the sciatic nerve, the gid hanasha. Many laws. So in addition to all of those laws, there's also the Torah tells us that you're not allowed to consume anything which is tam ke'ikr. What is tam ke'ikr? Where even if you're not consuming the actual non-kosher food, if you're consuming a taste of the non-kosher food because it was absorbed in a dish, in a pot, and then you cook kosher food in the pot later on, but the non-kosher food was absorbed in the pot. So the taste that is conveyed is also prohibited according to the Torah. So that's why we have the kasher kalim, and we have all of these very extensive stringencies when it comes to the pots and the pans that we use, and why you just can't walk into a non-kosher restaurant and order something which you think is kosher because the pots and the pans are infused with all kinds of non-kosher tastes. So there are many detailed and complicated laws, and most people wouldn't be able to figure it all out themselves and apply it all themselves if they had to start from scratch, which is why we have companies and agencies that provide kosher supervision, that have experts that make sure that the food that you're eating was produced in a proper fashion, where all the ingredients were kosher, where all of the utensils and equipment that were used to produce the food was kosher. So it's much easier nowadays. You could just walk into the supermarket and you look for the kosher symbol. You have a CRC, a Chicago Rabbinical Council card that tells you what are the recommended kosher symbols. You pull out your card and you see whether a particular product contains a recommended symbol, and you buy it, or you walk into a restaurant that has CRC certification. We make life so much easier for everybody. People should love us because this saves people a lot of trouble. So one of the laws of keeping kosher, there are also rabbinic laws. In addition to the laws that are derived directly from the Torah, there are also rabbinic laws as well. And the rabbinic laws include that you're not allowed to eat food that was cooked by somebody who wasn't Jewish, with certain exceptions. It includes that you can't have wine that was produced by non-Jews. Some of these laws were enacted in order to prevent intermarriage, but other laws were enacted because we're worried that if you're not extremely careful, maybe some non-kosher ingredients will get mixed in. So one example of a rabbinic law where we're worried about the admixture of non-kosher ingredients is when it comes to milk. When it comes to milk, what could be so bad about milk? Milk is pretty straightforward, right? I mean, Eretz Avas Chalav Udvash, the Torah is describing the virtues of Eretz Yisrael, of the land of Israel, says that it's the land of flowing milk and honey. So if the milk is described with great praise, it must be the milk is kosher. What could be a problem with respect to milk? So here, the Gemara has a derivation that when the Torah says that you're not allowed to eat camels, it says twice that you're not allowed to eat camels. Once in the book of Leviticus, in Vayikra, and once in the book of Deuteronomy, in Devarim, it says you're not allowed to eat camel. So why does it say it twice? So one derivation that the Gemara records from the Chachamim, the rabbis say, the Chad Le'eser Atzmo, one appearance of the word camel is to teach you that you can't eat camel, V'chad Le'eser Chelbo, and the other is to teach you that you can't drink the milk. You're not allowed to drink the milk of a camel because we have a general principle, Yotze Mina Asar Asar, that if something comes out of a non-kosher animal, then the byproduct of a non-kosher animal is also going to be not kosher. If I have a byproduct of a kosher animal, I have the milk that comes out of a cow, so that's going to be kosher. You say, oh, but the milk of the cow's not kosher in its lifetime. The cow, I'm not allowed to eat a live cow. I can only eat a dead cow. It's been shechted, so it's okay. The Torah says explicitly, Chalav Eretz Sabas Chalav Udvash. We know the milk is okay, so we don't have to worry about the milk of a cow. We know is okay. But if it's the milk coming out of a camel, so Esa Gamal teaches me that if it comes from a non-kosher animal, the milk from a non-kosher animal is going to be prohibited. you're not allowed to drink it. So therefore, what do I have to worry about when it comes to milk? I look at the milk, I don't know whether the milk is cow milk or whether the milk is camel milk. So the Gemara says, yeah, but camel milk has a slightly different color if it comes from a non-kosher animal. So the Gemara says, no, but if I mix in just a little bit of camel milk together with my cow milk, I wouldn't be able to notice that a little bit was mixed in, and that little bit is going to be prohibited, and therefore I still have to worry that I need adequate and proper supervision in order to ensure that the milk that I'm drinking is really from a cow and is not from a camel, it's not from a non-kosher animal. So this is where the Mishnayos in the Gemara in Maseches Avodah Zarah spell out that we need to have Chalav Yisrael. You've heard the term Chalav Yisrael, that you have to have Jewish milk. So what does Jewish milk mean? Does Jewish milk mean that all milk that we consume has to be manufactured by Jews? It has to be owned by Jews? That the Jews have to own the farm? Or that the cows have to be milked by Jews? What does it mean, Jewish milk? So the truth is that the term Jewish milk, Chalav Yisrael, is really just kind of a shorthand for a phrase in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, "Ve'elu mutarim ba'achila," these are permitted to be consumed. Chalav shechava o be'kachar mi'Yisrael v'oeu. If I have milk that was milked by a non-Jew and a Jew observe the process. That's what it means. V'Yisrael chalav v'Yisrael v'oeu. That I have milk that's milk that could be owned by non-Jews, manufactured by non-Jews, milked by non-Jews. Chalav Yisrael just means I have a Jew standing there. He says, oh, this is a cow. I know what a cow looks like. I know the difference between a cow and a camel. And I can see that the milk that's being produced is coming from a cow. And therefore I know that this is kosher milk. So that's Chalav Yisrael. And then the Mishnah also tells us that there's a type of milk which is forbidden. What's that type of milk? That is, even though it comes from a cow, and that's chalav akum. If it's the milk of a non-Jew, an idolater, it's a chalav akum. So what is the definition of chalav akum? So that's chalav shechava o be'kocharim ben Yisrael v'oeu. That's if I have a milk which is milked by a non-Jew. I didn't have a Jew who was there to supervise the process, and there's no Jew. There's no Jew who's watching. There's no Jew who's watching the milking process. So I have two very distinct categories. I have Chalav Yisrael, milk that was milked based with the observation of a Jew, and Chalav Akum, milk that was milked by a non-Jew that was not observed by a Jew. So if we get kosher supervision, the kosher supervision must mean, one would think, that we're on the farm, so we have one of our mashgichim are on the farms and they're watching the cows as they're being milked, and that's how we're able to certify it as kosher milk. So in fact, when we give certification that's called Chalav Yisrael certification, Chalav Yisrael certification means that a milk that a Jew is in fact observing. How much does the Jew have to observe? So this depends. That also the Gemara says it depends. If in fact there are animals on the farm that are non-kosher animals. Let's say it's a farm that has cows, and it also has pigs, and it also has cow. Old McDonald. You have the Old McDonald's farm. They're producing milk, and they have every single. Some of the animals say oink, and some of the animals say moo, and they make all kinds of noises. Some are kosher, some are not kosher. So then the Jew has to be able to. So the Jewish watch person, could be a man, could be a woman. The Jewish watch person has to be able to sit there. Doesn't have to watch the milking from beginning to end, but has to be able to be in a spot where if they would stand up, they'd be able to see. And every now and then they're going to stand up and they're going to see what exactly is being milked. And they see, in this batch it's only the cows that are being milked, and therefore I can certify that this milk is kosher. That's Chalav Yisrael. Then you might have other farms, says the Gemara, in which there's no davar tamei be'edro. It is all cows. There's nothing impure in the entire farm. All you have are cows. There are no camels. There are no pigs. There are no impure, non-kosher animals. And there, in order to produce Chalav Yisrael, says the Gemara, the Jew still has to be sitting there, but the Jew could be sitting like outside the farm. He's just sort of sitting on the porch, I don't know, watching TV, talking on his cell phone. The watchman could be just sitting there, and it's just making sure that there's no truck delivery that's coming inside of the farm where there are animals that are coming out of the truck that are non-kosher animals, or where there's non-kosher milk that's coming from the outside. But as long as there's a Jew who's just sitting in the area, just monitoring the general vicinity, so that would be considered Chalav Yisrael as well. So those are the parameters of Chalav Yisrael. So if we have Chalav Yisrael milk that's on the market, so that means that we've ensured that this level of supervision has taken place, and that's how we're able to certify the milk as Chalav Yisrael. So in addition to Chalav Yisrael and the Chalav Akum, there's a third kind of milk that some of the later rabbinic authorities, starting from a few hundred years ago, started talking about. And that is what is called Chalav Stam. Chalav Stam. That means it's milk, it's neither Chalav Yisrael, nor is it milk that we're really worried that the non-Jewish milk manufacturers or farmers mixed in any non-kosher milk. But it's kind of neither here nor there. What makes it neither here nor there? And then we know for a fact that there are no non-kosher animals, not only in this particular farm, but there are no non-kosher animals anywhere in the city that I have to worry that are ever even going to come into the farm. I don't have to worry that there's any non-kosher milk that's going to come into the farm. It's not realistic that there's a concern that they're going to start mixing the kosher milk with non-kosher milk. Or, alternatively, it could be that maybe there are non-kosher milk sources that are out there, but they're much more expensive. They're much more expensive than the kosher milk, because let's say I would have camel milk. It's much more difficult and expensive to produce, and therefore it's just not worth it. It's not worth it for the farmer to mix the ilk together with the cow milk and sell it at cow milk prices, because it would just be financially ill-advised to do such a thing. So therefore, says the Pri Chadash, this is source on page 2, the Pri Chadash came up with this heter, with this special dispensation, to say that if either you have a city or a vicinity where there is no non-kosher milk, or the only non-kosher milk that's available is very, very expensive, so then you don't really need any kind of supervision at all. And he says that the proof of this is that we see already that there are multiple levels of supervision that are described in the Gemara. That the Gemara says, if there are no non-kosher animals in the flock, in the farm, so then the watch person, the Jewish watch person, doesn't have to even be able to see the milking process. They can sit outside. So he says we could take it one step further. If it's completely unrealistic that non-kosher milk will ever be introduced, so then we can go further and say the person doesn't even have to sit outside. The person doesn't have to be them all together. We know that the milk is going to be kosher milk, and therefore you could rely upon the milk, you could drink the milk. And in fact, the Mishnah has another example of something which seems to operate similarly. The Mishnah says that the fish brine of the non-Jews you couldn't buy because they would typically mix the wine in the fish brine. So the Gemara says that then the wine was not kosher. So the Gemara says that if you live in a place where it's prohibitively expensive for them to mix a wine in the fish brine, because they would end up losing money, so that it would be monetarily ill-advised to do such a thing. So then, in such a case, says the Gemara, you're allowed to buy the fish brine. It's not a problem. As long as it's from a kosher fish, you could buy the fish brine. So the Pri Chadash says, we see from here that it all depends on what the realistic possibilities are of any admixture, and if you live in a place where there's no realistic concern that there's any non-kosher milk whatsoever that's going to get mixed in, you can rely upon that, and Chalav Stam would be permissible. So the Pri Chadash caused quite an uproar. The Pri Chadash was a young man. He was a young man when he wrote his commentary. He was in his early 30s. What was his name? Chizkiyahu Silva, something like that. He lived in the late 1600s. I think he died when he was about 35 years old. We think of all of the great rabbis who wrote these super commentaries as these old, white-haired rabbis, 85 years old. He was 30 years old. He wrote the commentary. So this is sobering for all of us. We have to get our acts together and write our commentaries to the Talmud, as soon as possible. He took care of his when he was 31 years old. So the Pri Chadash was an innovator in this regard, but he was opposed by many of the other giant rabbis of the generation. The Chassam Sofer, Moshe Sofer, said that there were no exceptions to the rule. That when the rabbi said that the milk, in order to be kosher, has to have a Jewish observer, either on the farm itself, either who's able to watch the activities of the farm, who's sitting outside of the farm, but they have to be there. This was what we can call a darash minyan. This was something that was decreed as an absolute gezerah, an absolute permanent enactment of the sages that can only be overturned by batei din, by rabbinical courts who are greater in stature and number than the original courts that promulgated this decree. And since we don't have that, this has to be observed no matter what. Just like the rabbis made a rule that gevina sakum, the cheese, if you're going to have cheese which is manufactured by non-Jews, even if the cheese is manufactured from chalav Yisrael, from milk that was observed by Jews when it was being milked, the cheese making process itself has to be supervised by Jews. That's called Kabinas Yisrael. And the way that we assume is that it has to not only be supervised, but that the Jew has to actually put the rennet in the milk that is being used to coagulate into cheese in order for it to be Gvinas Yisrael. And the Gemara asks, so what's the Mishnah and the Gemara talk about what's the reason that we require a Jew to participate in the cheese making process? And there are about 6 or 7 different answers that are given. And the Rambam quotes the Gaonim, the later rabbis after the period of the Talmud, the Gaonim, who said that this was a davar shebeminyan. This, whatever the reason was, you could say the reason is not applicable, it doesn't matter. Once this was established, it was established for all generations, whether the reason is applicable or the reason is not applicable. So the Chassam Sofer says the same thing is true with respect to chalav Yisrael. The same thing is true with respect to the requirement that you have a Jew who is present during the milking process. And others, like the Chayi Adam, said that it's not so much that this was an absolute permanent decree no matter what, but we see that even if there is an infinitesimal concern, like the case where there are no non-kosher animals on the farm, and nonetheless we still require that there be a Jewish watch person sitting at the entrance of the farm, even though it must be an infinitesimal concern that there'll be a mixture of non-kosher with kosher milk. So he says that in any case, even if there are no cows, even if there are no camels in the entire vicinity, or even if camel milk is much more expensive than cow milk and it's just economically unfeasible for the non-Jewish milk farmer to mix the kosher milk with the non-kosher milk, there's still an infinitesimal concern that maybe somebody will do it. They'll have a tiny little bit that's left over that they're not going to be able to sell, that they'll have nothing to do, that they'll have no use for unless they increase the volume of their cow milk supply. So there's still always an infinitesimal concern. That's all you need is a tiny little infinitesimal concern in order to justify the requirement that there be a Jew who is present. And the Aruch HaShulchan tells a story. He says that the Aruch HaShulchan was, of course, great Yechiel Michal Epstein was a great rabbi in Lithuania. He wrote a commentary on all of Shulchan Aruch that really just goes through like Kol HaTorah Kula. It was just an incredible, unbelievable Talmud Chacham, the Aruch HaShulchan. He was superseded, he was a little bit overshadowed by the Chafetz Chaim, because when the Aruch HaShulchan wrote his commentary about all the laws of daily life, he went through more than Orach Chaim. The Aruch HaShulchan went through the entirety of Shulchan Aruch. The Chafetz Chaim went through Orach Chaim, the laws of daily life, and Shabbos, and festivals, and brachos, and things of that sort. So when the Chafetz Chaim wrote his commentary, eventually, over time, the Chafetz Chaim's commentary was accepted by the majority of the Orthodox Jewish world, especially over the last 50 years or so. So people don't study the Aruch HaShulchan so much. But he was like a shulrav. The Chafetz Chaim sat at home and he learned. The Aruch HaShulchan dealt with day-to-day problems of his balabatim. He dealt with kind of like a real person situation. So sometimes he's more lenient than the Chafetz Chaim because he had to deal with like real life situations. The Chafetz Chaim says, this one is lenient, this one is strict, therefore we should be strict. That's kind of like, the general approach. So the Chafetz Chaim somehow picked up a lot of steam and support and fans over the years. And the Aruch HaShulchan is studied, but not as much as the Mishnah Berurah. So the Aruch HaShulchan tells this story. He says that he was a rav in a particular town. He went from town to town until he settled in the main place that he remained a rabbi. And in one of his towns, he had people who would go out to a particular inn, to a particular place where they served coffee, and they served this hot drink, this hot, delicious, milky drink. that they had milk and it had flavoring. It was a cappuccino. So they had this cappuccino. Then people said, "This is so delicious. This is amazing. That this is the greatest drink ever." And they didn't worry about the fact that the milk was not under kosher supervision because they were relying upon the Pri Chadosh. And then one day, the Aruch HaShulchan says this Baal Abbas, this member of his synagogue, decided that he would ask the innkeeper, "How do you make this incredibly delicious milk?" So Pamachas iskilu lakva b'nei me'ayin lokech hachenvani hakatan hazeh kol kach chalav shamin. Where does he get this delicious cappuccino from? What ingredients does he use? Balakul hachenvani v'shalo. So they asked the innkeeper, "V'amalei hachenvani and ikone be'idle shabasa habe mak shelo behemus v'mach osam habe ikol v'mashlim biyachad." I go to the market and I buy a lot of animal brains. And I mash up the animal brains and I mix the animal brains with the milk, and that's how I make this incredibly delicious product. V'zeu Hashem Nunis, and that's how I make the cappuccino. So he said, that's a problem. As nafal kulam al panei malchetam agados, they all collapsed in horror when they discovered that they were drinking a drink that was the trapest of the trape. Shakul trapus abasa b'cholav. They're eating animal brains and meat and milk mixed together. Every conceivable avera in the kashrut that you could think of. So this Baal Abbas came in front of the Aruch HaShulchan. He's vade, so he confessed that he did the wrong thing. Lefanai confessed in front of me, says the Aruch HaShulchan. V'tzak v'kol kama gedolim divrei chachamim, and he cried out, "How great are the words of our sages!" Here I was relying upon the Pri Chadosh, and I realized that I should have listened to all the other rabbis. And really, you need to have kosher supervision when it comes to any kind of milk products. That's the story of the Aruch HaShulchan. And then he throws in, like as an extra zinger, and he says, and especially in certain places, you have to be extra cautious, like in this new world that I have heard about called America. So in this place called America, you have to be especially careful. America, Yesh Rabim, this is written in the late 1800s, Yesh Rabim me'a'umo sheshosim cholav chazir. I heard that there are a lot of people there who are drinking pig milk. Because they have a lot of swine in America. You have all of these pigs all over the place in America. Everybody is drinking pig milk, so you got to be especially careful to have a Chalav Yisrael, to have a supervision on the farms, that there should be a Jewish watch person making sure that the milk is really coming from the cows. So the Pri Chadosh kind of wasn't really widely followed. However, in America, what happened, fast forward 50 years, after the Aruch HaShulchan, when you really had a much larger Jewish population in America, so they didn't have the luxury to send out Jewish mashgichim, supervisors to all of the farms to watch the milking process, but Jews were drinking milk. So they turned at that time to who was then an up-and-coming major rabbinic decisor in America, Rav Moshe Feinstein. People turned to Rav Moshe Feinstein and they asked him if there was any kind of a justification for the fact that people were consuming milk that was not being supervised on the farms directly by the Jewish watch people. So Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote a few tshuvos in which he discussed this issue. Rav Moshe Feinstein said he thinks that that even without the opinion of the Pri Chadosh, we can find other grounds for leniency. What would those grounds for leniency be? So he said, look, what is it that enables the case where I have the watch person who's sitting there to be effective even though they're not watching the milking process every single minute? Because they can jump up in any moment in time and they'll look at what's going on in the farm and see whether what's being milked are cows or some other animal. So because of the fact that the non-Jews who are milking their animals and want to sell it to the Jewish community know that this Jewish watch person is in the area, so that makes them what we call mirsus, that they're scared that the Jewish watch person is going to look at any moment in time. So said Rav Moshe Feinstein, we have the effective equivalent here in this country of the manufacturers being scared. What are they scared of? They're scared of the governmental supervisors because we have governmental rules and regulations in this country that say that when you sell milk, you're only allowed to sell milk that comes from cows. And if you're going to sell milk and it turns out that it comes from a camel or a pig, rather than coming from a cow, so you can lose your license. He spells out, he transliterates the word license. They'll lose they will have a lekichas, a license, shusegiras ha'ezek, that the license will be taken away. They'll have to close their entire business enterprise. So he says that the governmental supervision works on two different levels. One, that because they require the adherence to the very strict laws and regulations of the federal and state milk statutes, so therefore it's considered like they are on top of the farmers as they are conducting their milking of the cows, that they are present right there, because since we know that the people are not going to violate the governmental laws, it's kiriyah mamish. It's almost as if the governmental supervisors are watching. They're standing there watching over the farmers directly, and they're watching. Remember, this is a government, what is it? Of the people, by the people, for the people. So this is a government that represents us. So if the government is watching, so therefore it's as if we, the Jewish community, are watching as well. We, the people, are watching the milking process of the cows, and in addition, there's this mirsas, there's this fear, and that's equivalent to the watch person who's sitting in front of the farm, where the farmer knows that the watch person can walk in and see what's going on at any moment in time. So therefore, he says, the Igros Moshe says, this is as if you have a watch person who is stationed there, and one can supervise milk without it being Kol of Yisrael. It can be supervised, and you can give kashrut supervision on Kol of Stam, on regular milk in this country, in the United States, or whatever country you have very, very rigorous laws on this basis. So the kashrut agencies, for a very long time, relied upon Rav Moshe Feinstein. Now, did Rav Moshe recommend relying upon this dispensation to everybody? So Rav Moshe wrote that if you're a Baal Nefesh, meaning you're a person of very, very scrupulous Torah standards, so if you can be stringent, so it's a good thing to be stringent. And he said he personally was stringent. He personally was stringent only to consume real, bona fide, genuine Kol of Yisrael, where there were Jews who were present on the farms, but he did not impose the stringency upon others. And in fact, it's well known that he did not impose the stringency even upon his own family. Even his own family members, they drank regular milk without Kol of Yisrael certification, and especially in his days, it wasn't so easy to find Kol of Yisrael certification, and it generally was much more expensive, and it didn't last as long. I remember when I was a kid, you'd buy the Kol of Yisrael milk, it would last for maybe 2 hours, if that long, when you bought it, in the market. Now, Kol of Yisrael milk is much more available, and I think it's much more reasonably priced, and it's much better. Also, and much more longer lasting. You buy, the Lima's milk here in Chicago. It's excellent, very, very delicious tasting milk. So some say that even Rav Moshe Feinstein, if he would have lived today, if Rav Moshe Feinstein would have lived in Chicago in 2017, so he would not have provided this leniency, because it was so much easier now to observe Kol of Yisrael. But nonetheless, the reasoning still seems to be applicable. So therefore, this is the basic context. He also says, I'll just throw this in before we apply this to the modern day situation. He also says that there's an additional stringency when it comes to the Gevinas Yisrael, to the cheese making process. So what did I mention earlier about Gevinas Yisrael? So I said in the cheese manufacture itself, there's a requirement that a Jew pour the rennet and participate in the cheese making process. But the milk, does the milk have to be Kol of Yisrael milk? So Rav Moshe Feinstein said that the truth of the matter is that it's already a stringency to begin with, to require Kol of Yisrael, when, with respect to, even if I did not live in America, with respect to cheese making. Why is that? Because the rabbis had articulated a basic principle that the only milk that has the ability to curdle and coagulate into cheese is milk which is kosher milk. If it's non-kosher milk, you cannot make cheese out of non-kosher milk. So therefore, the Ramah, the Moshe Isserles, and the Shulchan Aruch, in his glosses on the Shulchan Aruch for the Ashkenazi community, so the Ramah said that really it's a chumrah. Really, it's a chumrah. It's a stringency to require Kol of Yisrael milk when it comes to the cheese making process. That when you make cheese, really, strictly speaking, you shouldn't have to require Kol of Yisrael milk, because as long as the milk becomes cheese, so that demonstrates that it must have been kosher milk in the first place. So it says Moshe Feinstein. Moshe Feinstein says that since it's already a chumrah, it's already a stringency to require Kol Yisrael milk with respect to the making of a cheese. So here in this country, where the truth of the matter is, he says it's a stringency anyway to require Kol Yisrael altogether, even if you weren't going to make the milk into cheese, even if you were just consuming it as milk, and you'd have to normally worry whether it's kosher milk or non-kosher milk. We know that it's kosher milk. So he said, so certainly when it comes to the manufacture of cheese, we do not need to worry anymore about this extra stringency of the cheese coming from Kol Yisrael milk. So that's why you'll find when you go to the supermarkets, you'll see that in addition to there being milk, that some of the milk will have kosher supervision that will say Kol Yisrael, and some will say OUD, right? OUD is kind of like, your official code that this is Kol Stam with kosher certification, and the CRC also has provided kosher certification to Kol Stam. And one of our major accounts in the area went to a different kashrut agency, so we don't have as much as we used to have anymore in that regard. We still have some. But also, if you look at the cheese that's sold in the supermarkets, so there's cheese that will say that it's Kol Yisrael and cheese that will not say Kol Yisrael. That doesn't mean some of the cheese has supervision during the cheese making process and some does not. With the cheese making process, everybody agrees that you need kashrut supervision, that you need for the participation of a Jewish party in terms of the making and manufacturing of the cheese. What that means is that some of the cheese was produced from Kol Yisrael milk, and some of the cheese was not produced from Kol Yisrael milk. So it says Moshe Feinstein, here in America, you don't even have to be stringent, even if you're a Baal Nefesh, even if you're one who's extremely scrupulous, even an extremely scrupulous person doesn't have to be machmir, doesn't have to be strict in that regard. Now again, not everybody agreed with Moshe Feinstein. There were those who said that Moshe Feinstein was not contributing a leniency that was any more profound or any more nuanced or sophisticated than the leniency that was propounded by the Pri Chodesh. And if you do not accept the Pri Chodesh, then you shouldn't accept this leniency of Moshe Feinstein either. So that's why there are people who are extremely stringent about only consuming Kol Yisrael, and even when it comes to Gvinas Yisrael, or even when it comes to the cheese making process, to be very stringent that it only comes from Kol Yisrael. Now that all being said, the kashrut agencies were prepared to be to be lenient, to provide kosher supervision with respect to milk products on the basis of this leniency of Moshe Feinstein. But what happened was that in the last 5 years or so, there was a woman who came along, not an evil woman, really a very, very fine woman. Her intention was not to throw the entire kosher food industry into a tizzy, but a woman named Millie Hinkle, who felt very, very strongly that we need to introduce and popularize camel milk for the American consumer. Why is that? Because camel milk is this incredibly wonderful and therapeutic product that is capable of curing all ills of the world, including autism, including all kinds of problems and illnesses and malaises that people could have, and maladies, and therefore she petitioned the federal government that the federal government should expand its definition of milk, of what's allowed to be sold in this country, to go beyond camel milk and goat milk, and which do not present a problem for the kosher consumer, but to allow camel milk as well. It used to be a felony in this country to sell camel milk, a felony. So she turned it around from a felony to a mitzvah, and she created a Camel Milk USA, which is a special camel milk industry where you can even look on the computer and you'll see that there are these pictures of these beautiful bucolic scenes of sprawling fields and beautiful trees and grass and camels that are grazing, and it talks about all of the beneficial health effects of drinking and consuming camel milk, and she created a camel milk market here in the United States. So the federal statute changed the definition of milk to allow for the sale of camel milk. So no longer could you say that just by virtue of the requirement for all the farms and the milk manufacturers to comply with the milk laws of the United States of America, that it was immediately apparent that they would only be able to sell cow milk, because now you could comply with all of the laws of the country and at the same time market and merchandise camel milk as well. So therefore there was a concern, this was raised with the Chicago Rabbinical Council, could we continue to provide kosher certification on the basis of Moshe Feinstein to the milk that is being produced in this country without Jews being present at the farms to observe or be capable of observing the milking process. So we had to investigate this a little bit. What would be a possible way out of this dilemma? Well, we have to look as to whether there's other legislation that would still be able to kind of provide a saving grace to this change in legislation. So on the federal level, there was a kind of a safety net legislation, and that was the labeling requirement. So there was a labeling requirement on the federal level that is in the federal pasteurized milk ordinance, section 4, which says all bottles, containers, packages containing milk or milk products except milk tank trucks, etc., shall be conspicuously marked with the common name of the hooved animal producing the milk, shall precede the name of the milk or milk product when the product is or is made from other than cattle's milk. In other words, if any milk is produced that does not come from a cow, it would be a violation of the federal statute if it is not conspicuously labeled on the product that it actually says camel milk. And if you would sell milk that is camel milk without identifying clearly that there is camel milk in this product, so that would be a violation of the statute, and presumably a farmer and milk manufacturer would still have to be worried that they could lose their license. So this was the saving grace. But what happened in Illinois is that in the Illinois statutes, they decided they're going to change their statute to conform with the federal statute, and they're going to allow for the sale of camel milk in addition to cow milk, so that they now redefine milk for purposes of the Illinois milk statute as including not only cow milk but also any hooved animal including camels. But they did not concomitantly at the same time incorporate into the Illinois state statutes the federal labeling requirements. So therefore there was the concern that your average farmer might not be alerted to the fact that while the state statutes now allow for the sale and production of camel milk within Illinois, that they would not necessarily appreciate that there was still this labeling requirement, in which case even if the federal statute would carry over to the state, which was not 100% clear if it was not interstate commerce, nonetheless you wouldn't have this feature of mirsus, of the fear that would be struck into their hearts based on the knowledge that this would be a violation. So therefore, in order to satisfy that mirsus component, we needed to introduce legislation. So who, of course, was called upon at the Chicago Rabbinical Council to go to Springfield to fight for this legislation? It was Rabbi Reiss goes to Springfield. That since I had a little bit of a background in law, and I was, after all, the chief rabbinical judge, so they felt that I should be the person to argue in front of the state legislature and the state senate, and so I did. First, I tried to convince them to just drop the camel milk altogether. I said, you know what, Millie Hinkle has, a very nice gig here where she is able to make changes on the federal level, but do we really need the camel milk here in Illinois? And they came to the conclusion that it would be unwise for them to vary at all from what exists on the federal level, that it's always very important for them to comply with the federal statutes, because once on a federal level, camel milk could be produced. They wanted to incorporate camel milk to make sure that to the degree that it is produced, that it also is subject to all of the laws governing the importance of weeding out any contaminants from the milk and ensuring proper pasteurization of the product. So therefore they felt that from a health perspective, it was very important to incorporate camel milk into their legislation. So I said, well, if that's the case, and I'm not going to win that battle, then at least allow me to incorporate the labeling requirements. So they did, in fact, allow me to incorporate the labeling requirements. The original language that I came up with was that once they expanded the definition of milk to include all hoofed animals, that all hoofed mammals, I wrote, provided that there is compliance with the labeling requirements set forth in the Grade A Pasteurized Milk Ordinance of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And then they came back to me and they said, that's too wordy. Let's just change it to provided that it is labeled in accordance with the current Grade A Pasteurized Milk Ordinance. So I said, I don't like provided that it is labeled, because I came up with language that said there must be compliance. Compliance implies that you're going to get into trouble for not complying. I want strong language indicating that this is a must. So therefore, I came up with the idea, I'll add the word must. So I added provided that it must be labeled in accordance with the current Grade A Pasteurized Milk Ordinance, and they went along with that. So that's how the statute reads now. Eventually, Governor Rauner signed it into law. It was a nice photo op for the executive leadership of the CRC. I was not in the picture, but they all stood there as he's signing, and everybody smiling for the camera. So this is now official legislation in the state of Illinois. But one other thing that came out during this time was that the raw milk lobby got very, very upset, because they said you don't have a carve-out here for us raw milk folks, because the raw milk lobbyists had fought for the right to be able to sell and to produce raw milk on the farms. That would not be subject to all of the pasteurization requirements of the federal statute. And since they were not subject to the pasteurization, obviously it's raw milk, not subject to the pasteurization requirements of the federal statute, they also were not subject to the labeling requirements of the federal statute. So therefore they said that since raw milk has to be included in the definition of milk, we want to carve out that when you say that all milk has to be subject to these labeling requirements, the raw milk is not subject to the labeling requirements. If you say we're subject to labeling requirements, maybe we're subject to pasteurization requirements, and there goes our raw milk dispensation. So therefore they fought very, very hard for this. And I really tried to stop these raw milk folks, but they were very aggressive, the raw milk folks. The raw milk folks got their carve out, and that created a remaining problem, because now in the farms where there is this ability to sell the raw milk, to produce and to sell the raw milk, and they're not subject to labeling requirements, you really don't have the heter, you don't have the dispensation of Rav Moshe anymore. You only have the ability to rely upon Rav Moshe with respect to the pasteurized milk that gets brought to the milk manufacturing facilities where they pasteurize the milk and then they sell the milk from there, where there's governmental oversight over there. So that's where you have the ability to rely upon Rav Moshe, but at this point you actually could not rely upon Rav Moshe when it comes to the farms. So what ends up is that we have an argument in the ability when it comes to the pasteurized milk, based on the incorporation of the labeling requirements into the federal law and also into the state law here in Illinois, to be able to continue to provide kosher certification. But for somebody who wanted to go onto a farm where there was no Jew present during the milking process and just pick up a glass of milk from a farm, they would not, even if there were no camels on that particular farm, since the dispensation of Rav Moshe is not available. So a person who is keeping kosher would not actually be able to consume raw milk that is produced on any of the farms here in Illinois. This is true in other places too. There was somebody who came over to me and said, I'm a believer in raw milk. I'm, the beneficial health effects of raw milk and so forth. So am I allowed to go onto the farms in order to buy the raw milk that they are selling there? And I said, no, unless you actually are present during the milking process. So that's, one very, interesting other development that came about through all of these changes to the reality on the ground. The other thing that's sort of interesting is whether one wanted to rely upon the pre-Chodesh. Let's go back to the pre-Chodesh. There were those Remember, the word like the Balabas who got himself into a lot of trouble in the Aruch HaShulchan's town, there were those who over the centuries relied upon the Pri Chadosh as well. So there's a commentator, the Beis Meir, who said, well, we shouldn't rely upon the Pri Chadosh for another reason. The Pri Chadosh's dispensation really only is applicable when there's a market for the non-kosher milk. Because if there's a market for the non-kosher milk, and the non-kosher milk is much more expensive than the kosher milk, camel milk is $80 to $130 a gallon. That's like substantially more expensive than the cow milk. So if there's a market for it, so we understand the Pri Chadosh, that why would a person be tempted to mix their camel milk with the cow milk when they'll end up losing so much money? But if there's no market, so then all that milk would have to be thrown out anyway, so then you'd have to be worried about it. So therefore he says the Pri Chadosh's leniency only applies when you have a market. So it turns out that while Moshe's leniency has become more problematic as a result of the introduction of the federal camel milk legislation, the Pri Chadosh's leniency has actually become much more viable as a result. So that's another important consideration to take into mind. But the other thing that has been discovered is that you have these very advanced milk technology firms that are now discovering ways in which they can take the camel milk and they can produce cheese through the camel milk. Who knew? Our rabbi said that when you take the non-kosher milk, you're not going to be able to produce cheese from the non-kosher milk, and yet there are now companies that have figured out ways in which they can take camel milk and they're able to coagulate the camel milk, and for that matter, donkey milk. They're figuring out all kinds of non-kosher milks that they can use to produce cheese. So the other heter, the other leniency of Moshe Feinstein, namely that if you are strict about Chalav Yisrael, about only having the milk that was supervised by Jewish observers, you don't have to be strict and exercise a double stringency of using only Chalav Yisrael for the cheese which is produced from that milk, because after all, cheese can only come from kosher milk. So now, because of the facts on the ground, that particular leniency has come into question as well. But not so much, because Moshe was really talking about hard cheese, and so far most of the cheese that they have been able to produce from camel milk or donkey milk, as the case may be, really is cheese that is essentially softish cheese in nature, either completely soft or semi-soft cheese. But in terms of the real hard cheese, they're still not really able to produce significant hard cheese from the non-kosher milk. So I think that we're still okay in that regard. And finally, and I'll conclude with this, and next time, we'll talk about our other, interesting kashrus issues. The raw milk lobby has also accomplished something very good in an inadvertent fashion. Mostly they've been a tremendous headache for me, but in one particular respect, they've been good, and that is, we mentioned this idea of bishul akum, okay? That when we consume food, so there are many foods which we cannot consume if they have been cooked by somebody who is outside of the Jewish faith. That's called bishul akum. There are two exceptions to bishul akum. One is if the food was edible raw, and the other is if it's a food that is not fit to be served at the table of kings. So what do you do with milk when the milk is pasteurized? The milk is pasteurized, it's essentially being cooked through the pasteurization process. So don't we always have a problem with bishul akum, right? So how is it that we're able to consume the milk? So the Rambam Maimonides says that no problem, milk can be consumed raw. So later authorities came along and they said, that's nice, maybe that was true in the Rambam's day, but now we all know that raw milk is really dangerous and it's all kinds of contaminants and it's really, really bad for you. It's like when we go to Mariano's and we buy the unpasteurized orange juice, and the grapefruit juice that's freshly squeezed, and we serve it on our table, and my kids always direct the Shabbos guest to what it says, on the label. Warning, this could be really dangerous and can kill you because it hasn't been pasteurized. So when it comes to the milk, so the milk was really, really dangerous. So later poskim said, we can't rely upon that. The Minchas Yitzchak was the dayan of the Eidah Charedis in Yerushalayim, of Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss, he wrote a tshuva in which he said he doesn't think that we can really rely upon the idea that milk is consumed in its raw state. We have to rely upon a couple of other considerations, namely that it's produced in a factory setting, and maybe that's not as bad. You're less likely to intermarry with the people who run the factory because you don't know who they are. Number two, that the pasteurization is really done through a steaming process, and some say steaming is not really like cooking. But he said that these are difficult leniencies, and therefore somebody who's really scrupulous should just stay away from drinking milk unless it's, even the pasteurization process is done through juice. This was in Eretz Yisrael where that was feasible, but that's what he wrote. So now it turns out, at least in America, we don't have the problem of Minchas Yitzchak anymore, because now in places like Illinois, where they have officially codified that it's perfectly legitimate to consume raw milk, and it can be sold at least on the farms. So even if not everybody is drinking the raw milk, the fact that it has become normalized for there to be raw milk that is drunk by people in the region. So according to the Ritva, that normalization through legislation is considered to be good enough that now it's officially considered to be something consumed in its raw state, so we don't have to worry about the Bishul Akum ramifications of the pasteurization process. So this is all by way of just showing how your local betin is working for you. To make sure that you're able to have kosher products such as the milk and the cheese that you consume, and God willing, next week we'll speak about some other very fascinating kosher issues.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much.